Draco may give us the right idea as to how gliding, flying amongst the reptiles started. But one thing is certain, flapping flight, powered flight, remained the preserve of the insects for a very long time. And then one group of reptiles developed even that. And the evidence of how they did so is really very intriguing. "350 million years ago, long before birds crossed the horizon and long before bats flickered through twilight skies, the air above the continents belonged to no one. The world was in the late Carboniferous period, a time when Earth's surface looked alien compared to today. There were no flowering plants, no grasslands, no mammals, and no dinosaurs. Instead, vast equatorial swamps stretched across supercontinents, thick with towering forests of primitive plants. These forests would one day become the coal seams that power modern civilization. But in this moment of deep time, they formed one of the most biologically productive landscapes the planet had ever seen. The supercontinent was part of what geologists call Euramerica, while the larger land masses were slowly assembling into what would later become Pangaea. Tropical climates dominated the equatorial belt. Warm temperatures, heavy rainfall, and stagnant wetlands created immense peat-forming swamps. In these lowlands grew giant lycopsids, some rising over 30 meters tall, with scaly trunks and narrow crowns. Tree-sized horsetails formed dense stands. Fern-like plants covered the understory in tangled green layers. Sunlight filtered through a haze of humidity and spores, creating a dim, filtered world of green and shadow. This was not a silent world. Amphibians lurked in shallow waters, their bodies heavy and sprawling, descendants of fish that had only recently conquered land. Some resembled oversized salamanders, while others had broad, flattened heads armed with sharp teeth. They were among the dominant vertebrate predators of their time. Yet even they were newcomers compared to the invertebrates that had already begun to shape terrestrial ecosystems. The atmosphere itself was different. Oxygen concentrations were significantly higher than today, possibly reaching 30 to 35% compared to the modern 21%. This change altered everything. Fire behaved differently. Respiration worked differently. And organisms, especially arthropods, could grow to sizes that would be impossible under modern atmospheric conditions. The air was thick, rich, and chemically primed for experimentation. But despite this abundance, the sky remained unused. Above the canopy of these primeval forests was open space. No wings cut through the humid air. No shadows crossed the swamp floor from above. Life had colonized the oceans for hundreds of millions of years. It had crawled onto land, adapting lungs, limbs, and protective skins. But the vertical dimension, the air itself, was untouched territory. Gravity still held organisms firmly to the ground or to the surface of water. In this pre-flight world, movement across land was constrained. Arthropods scuttled across bark and leaf litter. Early insects crept along stems and trunks. Amphibians lumbered through mud and shallow pools. Dispersal was slow. Predators relied on ambush and proximity. Ecological interactions occurred largely within two dimensions, across the forest floor and through the waterlogged undergrowth. Arthropods were already diverse. Millipedes, the size of small logs, crawled through decaying vegetation. Giant predatory arthropods hunted smaller invertebrates. Their success was built on a powerful design. A segmented body, encased in an exoskeleton, jointed limbs for mobility, and an efficient tracheal respiratory system that delivered oxygen directly to tissues. They were lightweight relative to their strength. Their bodies were modular. They molted to grow, and critically, their rigid exoskeleton provided anchor points for muscle attachment. This architecture would later prove ideal for flight, but at this stage, wings did not yet exist. Life's conquest of land had already required enormous evolutionary innovation. Fish had modified fins into weight-bearing limbs. Lungs had evolved to extract oxygen from air. Skin had become more resistant to desiccation. Eggs had adapted protective membranes to survive outside water. Each of these transitions required incremental changes over millions of years. Flight would demand an even greater transformation, the ability to generate lift sufficient to overcome gravity. To understand why flight had not yet appeared, we must consider the constraints. Gravity imposes a constant downward force to leave the ground. An organism must generate upward force greater than its body weight. This requires specialized structures, strong yet lightweight materials, precise muscle control, and an aerodynamic surface capable of interacting with air in a controlled way. It is not enough to jump or fall. True flight requires sustained lift and thrust. Yet the environment of the Carboniferous was quietly assembling the prerequisites. The dense forests created vertical complexity. Canopy layers rose high above the swamp floor. Climbing became advantageous. Reaching new feeding surfaces meant ascending trunks and branches. Predators stalked from below. Prey species sought new escape routes. The three-dimensional structure of the forest was a laboratory for experimentation in vertical movement. Small arthropods living on tree trunks could fall and glide, even without true wings. Any extension of the body that increased surface area could slow descent. Individuals that fell more slowly were less likely to be injured. Those that could control their descent could escape predators or reach new food sources. Over time, natural selection would favor structures that improved aerial control. The story of flight begins not with powered wing beats, but with falling. Gravity is not merely a constraint, it is also an opportunity. In tall forests, height becomes a resource. An organism that climbs can convert potential energy into motion. If it can glide, it can travel horizontally without descending immediately to the ground. This is energetically efficient compared to crawling long distances. In a dense swamp ecosystem where the forest floor might be crowded with predators and decomposers, The ability to bypass ground-level hazards would be transformative. Meanwhile, oxygen-rich air allowed metabolic experimentation. Higher oxygen availability supports greater aerobic capacity. Muscle tissue can sustain more activity. Diffusion through tracheal systems becomes more effective. In modern insects, body size is limited, partly because oxygen must diffuse directly through tubes without the aid of lungs or circulatory oxygen carriers like hemoglobin. In the Carboniferous, diffusion distances could be greater without starving tissues of oxygen. This relaxation of constraint permitted larger body sizes and possibly more robust musculature. The swamps also produced immense quantities of plant matter. As plants died and fell into stagnant waters, decomposition was incomplete. Peat accumulated in thick layers. Microbial processes locked away carbon, gradually reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide and increasing oxygen. This biochemical feedback reshaped global climate and atmospheric chemistry. In effect, the forests themselves engineered a world in which aerial experimentation became feasible. Yet, evolution does not plan ahead. There was no destiny guiding insects toward the sky. Instead, countless small variations arose within populations, minor protrusions from the thorax, subtle changes in muscle arrangement, slightly altered behaviors. Each variation tested against the environment. Most would fail. A few would confer advantage. On the forest floor, predation pressures intensified. Amphibians with improved jaws and stronger limbs expanded their hunting territories. Arthropods that could not evade them were consumed. Those that could climb higher, move faster, or disperse further survived. Selective pressure accumulated over generations, nudging lineages toward greater mobility. Insects, or more precisely early hexapods, were already experimenting with new forms. Their bodies consisted of three main segments: head, thorax, and abdomen. The thorax bore 3 pairs of legs. This central body plan offered a structural platform from which additional appendages could potentially arise. In crustaceans, appendages served multiple functions: feeding, locomotion, respiration. Evolutionary history had already demonstrated that limbs could be repurposed. Genetic pathways controlling appendage development were flexible. One hypothesis suggests that insect wings originated from modified gill structures in aquatic ancestors. Another proposes that rigid extensions of the thoracic exoskeleton, called paranotal lobes, initially functioned as stabilizers for gliding. Regardless of origin, the transformation required integration of musculature, articulation, and neural control. Flight demands precise timing and coordination. Even slight asymmetry in wing motion can destabilize an organism in air. But before such sophistication emerged, there was a long transitional phase. Imagine a small, climbing arthropod high on the trunk of a lycopsid tree. A predator approaches from below. In panic, the arthropod releases its grip. It falls. Individuals with slightly broader thoracic plates experience more air resistance. They descend more slowly. Some may even tilt and glide toward a neighboring branch. This slight advantage means survival. Those without such structures fall quickly and are consumed. Over thousands and then millions of generations, selection amplifies these differences. What began as passive surfaces become more pronounced, muscles attached to their bases, in controls. Gliding transitions into controlled descent. Controlled descent becomes brief flapping, and flapping, if synchronized and powerful enough, becomes flight. But in chapter 1 of this story, that transformation has not yet occurred. The air above the swamp remains unbroken by wing beats. Instead, spores drift lazily through humid currents. Insects crawl rather than fly, and predators strike from ground or water, not from above. This absence of aerial predators shapes behavior. There is no need to watch the sky. Camouflage focuses on blending with bark and leaf litter, not with open air. Communication occurs through chemical signals and substrate vibrations, not airborne displays. Ecological niches remain unoccupied, waiting. It is important to recognize how rare flight is in the history of life. Among millions of species that have existed, powered flight evolved independently only a few times. In insects, in pterosaurs, in birds, and in bats. Each event required extraordinary anatomical innovation in the Carboniferous. Only one lineage would succeed first. The stage was set. High oxygen levels allowed for larger bodies and greater metabolic potential. Vertical forests created ecological incentives. Arthropod exoskeletons provided structural scaffolding. Genetic pathways permitted appendage modification. Predation pressures rewarded mobility. All ingredients were present, but the synthesis had not yet occurred. Earth, at this moment, stood on the threshold of a revolution. The conquest of land had expanded life from oceans to continents. The conquest of air would expand it from 2 dimensions into 3. Ecosystems would transform. Food webs would gain vertical complexity. Dispersal rates would accelerate dramatically. Isolated populations would connect. Evolutionary rates would increase as gene flow expanded across regions. But none of that was visible yet in the quiet swamps of the late Carboniferous. Instead, there was humidity, heat, and stillness. Massive trunks rising from black waters. Amphibians breathing in shallow pools. Millipedes weaving through decaying plant matter. Early insects climbing patiently upward, unaware that some of their descendants would soon master the sky. The air, rich with oxygen and heavy with moisture, hovered unused above the canopy. It was a frontier without borders, an empty dimension waiting for exploitation. Life had already proven its capacity for innovation. It had turned fins into limbs, gills into lungs, and scales into protective skins. It had reshaped continents through biological processes and altered the chemistry of the atmosphere itself. The next step would require converting rigid exoskeletal plates into aerodynamic surfaces and transforming gravity from a barrier into a tool. In the coming chapters, that transformation will begin. But here, at the beginning, we stand in a world before wings, a world balanced on the edge of evolutionary possibility, where the sky remains silent and untouched, and where the first faint experiments with falling will eventually lead to one of the most significant biological revolutions in Earth's history. To understand how life first took to the skies, we must examine the world that made such a transformation possible. 350 million years ago, during the late Carboniferous period, Earth was not merely different in detail. It was fundamentally different in structure, chemistry, climate, and ecological architecture. This was a superworld, a planet operating under atmospheric and biological conditions that have not existed since. The continents were converging. Large land masses such as Laurentia and Baltica had already collided, forming Euramerica to the south. Gondwana loomed massive and glaciated in parts. Tectonic forces were steadily drawing these pieces together into what would later assemble into Pangaea. Mountain ranges rose where continents collided. Erosion fed sediments into vast lowland basins. Those basins became swamps, immense, humid, oxygen-rich wetlands that defined the Carboniferous. These swamps stretched across equatorial regions for thousands of kilometers. They were flat, waterlogged, and densely vegetated. Rainfall was abundant. Temperatures were warm and relatively stable. Seasonal variation was minimal near the equator. This climatic stability allowed ecosystems to become extraordinarily productive. The forests themselves were unlike any modern forest. There were no flowering plants, no fruit, no grass. Instead, the canopy was dominated by giant lycopsids such as Lepidodendron and Sigillaria. These were not true trees in the modern sense, but massive club moss relatives. Their trunks were tall and straight, often exceeding 30 meters in height, with diamond-patterned bark marking the scars of fallen leaves at their crowns. Narrow leaves formed umbrella-like clusters. Alongside them grew calamites, giant relatives of modern horsetails, with segmented bamboo-like stems. Tree ferns spread wide fronds across the mid-canopy. Seed ferns, an extinct lineage, contributed to the dense vegetation. The understory was thick with smaller plants, creating a layered ecosystem that captured sunlight at multiple levels. This density had consequences. First, it created enormous primary productivity. Plants converted atmospheric carbon dioxide into biomass at extraordinary rates. Second, when these plants died, they often fell into stagnant anoxic waters where decomposition was incomplete. Bacteria and fungi capable of efficiently breaking down lignin had not yet evolved to their modern capacity. As a result, vast quantities of plant material accumulated as peat. Over millions of years, burial and compression transformed this peat into coal. This is why we call this interval the Carboniferous, literally coal-bearing. The coal deposits formed during this time would one day power industrial revolutions hundreds of millions of years later. But in the Carboniferous itself, this carbon burial had another effect. It altered the atmosphere. As carbon was locked away underground, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels declined. Simultaneously, oxygen levels rose. Estimates suggest oxygen concentrations may have reached between 30 and 35%, far higher than today's 21%. This change reshaped the biosphere in profound ways. Oxygen is critical for aerobic metabolism. Higher oxygen concentrations allow for more efficient diffusion into tissues, particularly in organisms that rely on passive respiratory systems. Arthropods breathe through spiracles connected to branching tracheae that deliver oxygen directly to cells. Diffusion limits how large such organisms can become under modern oxygen levels. But in a high oxygen world, diffusion distances increase. Tissues can receive adequate oxygen even at larger body sizes. This partially explains one of the most striking features of the Carboniferous, gigantism among arthropods. On the forest floor crawled Arthropods, a millipede-like arthropod that could exceed 2 meters in length. Predatory relatives of modern dragonflies, such as Meganeura, would eventually reach wingspans approaching 70 centimeters. Enormous scorpions hunted in wetlands. Compared to modern insects, these organisms were colossal, but gigantism was not merely a curiosity. It altered ecological dynamics. Larger predators required more energy. Larger prey species developed new defenses. Energy transfer through food webs became more complex. The forests were not only vertically layered, but also densely interconnected trophically. In waterlogged pools and slow-moving channels, amphibians thrived. These early tetrapods were diverse, ranging from small insectivores to massive ambush predators with broad skulls and powerful jaws. Their reproduction was still tied to water. Eggs lacked the amniotic membranes that would later allow reptiles to reproduce fully on land. As a result, amphibians remained closely associated with swamps and rivers. Yet, a major evolutionary innovation was emerging quietly during this time: the amniotic egg. Early reptiles, the first amniotes, began to appear in the late Carboniferous. Unlike amphibians, they could lay eggs on land thanks to protective membranes that prevented desiccation and allowed gas exchange. This adaptation freed them from dependence on aquatic environments for reproduction. Although they were small and relatively inconspicuous compared to giant arthropods, their evolutionary significance would be enormous. They were the ancestors of reptiles, birds, and mammals. But at this moment, vertebrates were still secondary players in terrestrial ecosystems. Arthropods dominated both in diversity and in ecological innovation. The structure of the forests created a vertical gradient of environmental conditions. Near the ground, humidity was extreme. Decaying vegetation produced a constant layer of detritus. Fungal networks spread through peat-rich soils. Above the canopy received direct sunlight and experienced slightly drier conditions. Wind currents moved more freely at higher elevations. This vertical stratification created microhabitats, organisms adapted to specific layers. Some arthropods specialized in leaf litter, others inhabited tree trunks. Some fed on spores. Others preyed on smaller invertebrates. Climbing became a common behavior. In such an environment, the ability to move vertically conferred advantage. Climbing allowed access to new food sources and refuge from ground predators. But climbing also introduced risk. A fall from 20 or 30 meters could be fatal. Any anatomical feature that slowed descent or improved landing stability would be selected. Meanwhile, atmospheric physics under high oxygen conditions may have subtly influenced combustion and ecological disturbance. Wildfires likely occurred more frequently, as oxygen-rich air lowers ignition thresholds. Charcoal deposits from the Carboniferous support evidence of widespread fires. These fires created patchy landscapes, clearing areas of forest and opening ecological niches. Disturbance drives evolution. Cleared areas allowed pioneer species to colonize rapidly. Dispersal ability became increasingly valuable. Organisms capable of moving efficiently across fragmented habitats gained reproductive advantage. This is where the potential for aerial dispersal becomes crucial. Even before powered flight evolved, small arthropods could be carried by wind. Lightweight bodies could become airborne unintentionally, and individuals that survive such displacement might colonize new areas. Over time, morphological traits that enhance aerial stability would be favored. The exoskeleton of arthropods provided a structural platform for innovation, composed primarily of chitin. It offered strength with relatively low weight. Internal muscles attached to its inner surfaces, enabling precise control of movement. Segmentation allowed specialization of body regions. The thorax, already dedicated to locomotion through 3 pairs of legs, became the focal point for further modification. Genetic regulation of appendage development in arthropods is controlled by conserved developmental pathways, including Hox genes. Small mutations in regulatory sequences can produce significant morphological changes without disrupting entire body plans. This modularity makes arthropods particularly adaptable. The Carboniferous atmosphere also influenced sound transmission and sensory perception. Denser air may have altered acoustic properties. However, at this stage, communication remained largely substrate-based. Vibrations transmitted through plant stems and soil, chemical pheromones guided mating and aggregation. Visual signals were limited by dense vegetation. The sky above remained open, but environmental complexity below increased continuously. Another factor shaping this world was the global carbon cycle. Massive burial of organic carbon gradually cooled the planet by reducing greenhouse gases. Glaciations expanded in southern Gondwana. Sea levels fluctuated as ice sheets advanced and retreated. Coastal swamps periodically flooded and drained, creating cycles of habitat change. These oscillations added further selective pressure for mobility. Organisms that could relocate quickly during environmental shifts had greater survival probability. Limited to crawling or walking, most arthropods faced constraints. Any incremental improvement in dispersal efficiency could be transformative. It is important to recognize that evolution operates without foresight. Wings did not appear because the sky was empty. They appeared because incremental changes provided immediate advantages. Gliding to escape predators, stabilizing falls from height, increasing dispersal range. Each step was adaptive in the present context. In a dense Carboniferous forest, falling was common. Tree bark was rough, but not always secure. Storms could shake branches violently. Individuals that survived falls more consistently passed on their genes. Aerodynamic surfaces need not initially produce lift. They only need to increase drag. Drag is often viewed negatively in modern aeronautics, but in early evolution, it was beneficial. Increased surface area slows descent, and lateral extensions of the thorax, even if rigid and immobile, could function as parachutes over generations. Such extensions might enlarge. Articulation could evolve gradually. Muscles originally used for other purposes might become co-opted to move these structures. This process of exaptation, where existing structures acquire new functions, is central to evolutionary innovation. Feathers in birds likely evolved initially for insulation or display before enabling flight. Similarly, early wing-like structures in insects may have originated for thermoregulation, display, or stabilization before achieving powered flight. High oxygen concentrations also influence muscle performance. Oxygen supports aerobic respiration in mitochondria, producing ATP efficiently. Increased oxygen availability could allow more sustained muscular activity, potentially supporting early flapping behaviors once articulation evolved. The Carboniferous superworld was therefore characterized by a convergence of enabling factors: extensive vertical vegetation, high atmospheric oxygen, arthropod exoskeletal architecture, genetic modularity, predation pressure, environmental disturbance. Each factor alone might not produce flight. Together, they created a permissive landscape for aerial experimentation. It is worth emphasizing that vertebrates did not pioneer flight. Despite possessing internal skeletons and more complex nervous systems, they lacked the structural simplicity and small body size that facilitated early experimentation. Vertebrate flight would come much later after extensive anatomical reconfiguration. Arthropods, by contrast, were small, numerous, and developmentally flexible. Their populations were large, increasing the probability of beneficial mutations. Their short generation times accelerated evolutionary processes. Natural selection could act rapidly. As the late Carboniferous progressed, lineages of winged insects, pterosaurs, began to diverge from wingless ancestors. The fossil record shows increasingly sophisticated wing venation patterns, suggesting gradual refinement of aerodynamic control. Early forms were likely weak flyers, perhaps limited to short bursts. But even limited flight dramatically alters ecological interactions. The moment the first insect achieved sustained, powered flight, ecosystems changed irreversibly. Predators could now attack from above. Prey could escape vertically. Dispersal distances expanded dramatically. Gene flow increased between previously isolated populations. Evolutionary rates accelerated. But within this chapter, we remain just before that threshold. The superworld is primed, but not yet transformed. The swamps breathe oxygen-rich air into a heavy atmosphere. Giant arthropods crawl and climb. Amphibians lurk in murky pools. Early reptiles explore drier ground cautiously. Fires occasionally sweep through forests, reshaping landscapes. Peat accumulates silently beneath stagnant waters. Above the canopy, humid air drifts without wings. This Carboniferous superworld represents one of the most biologically dynamic intervals in Earth's history. It is a laboratory of gigantism, atmospheric alteration, and structural complexity within its dense forests. The groundwork for flight is being laid molecule by molecule, gene by gene, generation by generation. Soon, that groundwork will produce a revolution. But before wings beat against this ancient sky, evolution must first experiment with form, subtle protrusions, passive glides, and incremental improvements in control. The sky will not be conquered in a single leap. It will be approached cautiously through countless small steps shaped by the unique conditions of this extraordinary world. Long before wings ever sliced through Carboniferous air, insects had already begun a quieter revolution on land. Their success did not begin with flight. It began with structure, efficiency, and scale. To understand how life first took to the skies, we must first understand how insects came to dominate the ground. The earliest insects evolved from crustacean-like ancestors hundreds of millions of years earlier. These ancestral arthropods transitioned from aquatic environments to terrestrial habitats, carrying with them a body plan that would prove extraordinarily adaptable. Segmentation, jointed appendages, and a chitinous exoskeleton were not new inventions of the Carboniferous. They were inherited tools, refined over deep evolutionary time. The insect body was simple, but powerful in design. 3 primary segments: head, thorax, abdomen, 6 legs attached to the thorax. Antennae for sensory perception. Compound eyes, capable of detecting movement with high sensitivity. Internal tracheal tubes, branching throughout the body to deliver oxygen directly to tissues. This decentralized respiratory system eliminated the need for complex lungs or circulatory oxygen transport. This design was efficient. It scaled well to small body sizes, and critically, it allowed rapid reproduction and short generational turnover. Where vertebrates required years to mature, insects could complete life cycles in months or less. Evolutionary change could therefore accumulate quickly. In the early Carboniferous, The first true insects were small and wingless. These primitive forms are collectively referred to as apterygots. They included lineages similar to modern bristletails and silverfish. Their bodies were elongated, flattened, and built for crawling through leaf litter and under bark. They fed on decaying plant material, fungi, and spores. These early insects lived in a world dominated by moisture. Desiccation was a constant threat. Their exoskeletons provided protection against water loss, but they still preferred humid microhabitats. The swamp forests of the Carboniferous were ideal. Constant rainfall and thick vegetation maintained stable humidity near the ground. At this stage, insects were not yet the aerial masters we recognize today. They were ground dwellers, climbers, and burrowers. But even in this early form, they possessed traits that would later facilitate flight. The thorax, composed of 3 segments, prothorax, mesothorax, and metathorax, already bore powerful musculature for locomotion, legs articulated with precision. Muscles attached internally to the exoskeleton provided leverage. The structural rigidity of chitin allowed force transmission without collapse. More importantly, the genetic architecture controlling appendage development was modular. Hox genes regulated the identity of body segments. Small mutations in these regulatory genes could alter the shape or presence of appendages without destabilizing the entire organism. This flexibility made insects particularly prone to morphological experimentation. In the dense Carboniferous forests, climbing behavior was common. Insects scaled trunks of lycopsids and calamites in search of food or mates. The vertical dimension offered opportunity. Spores and tender plant tissues were abundant, higher in the canopy. Predators on the ground were avoided by ascending. Climbing, however, introduced risk. Gravity was unforgiving. A misstep meant a fall. And in a forest with trunks reaching 30 meters or more, falls could be lethal. Natural selection operates relentlessly on survival probabilities. Individuals that survived falls more frequently left more offspring. Even slight improvements in stability during descent could make the difference between life and death. Consider the physics of falling. When an object descends through air, it accelerates until drag balances gravitational force. Increasing surface area increases drag, reducing terminal velocity. For small-bodied organisms, even modest lateral extensions can significantly slow descent. Insects already possessed lateral plates along their thoracic segments. These plates, known as paranotal loads, may have initially functioned in thermoregulation or structural reinforcement. But under the selective pressure of frequent falls, individuals with slightly larger lateral extensions would descend more slowly. This is the beginning of aerodynamic experimentation. It did not begin with flapping. It began with passive surfaces interacting with air. Over generations, these extensions could enlarge. Their orientation might shift slightly to optimize drag. Individuals capable of angling their bodies during descent could achieve directional control. Even minimal control would allow them to steer toward tree trunks rather than falling directly to the swamp floor. The evolutionary advantage was clear. Controlled descent, reduced mortality. Reduced mortality increased reproductive success. Meanwhile, predation pressures intensified. Amphibians hunted aggressively in wetlands. Giant arthropods preyed on smaller invertebrates. Competition for food was fierce. Dispersal ability became increasingly important as forests expanded and fragmented due to fires and climatic fluctuations. Insects possessed another critical trait. Metamorphosis was beginning to evolve in some lineages. Although complete metamorphosis would appear later, early forms of gradual metamorphosis allowed different life stages to exploit different ecological niches. Juveniles and adults could reduce competition with each other by occupying separate microhabitats. This life cycle flexibility increased ecological resilience. Populations could recover rapidly from disturbances. Rice mutation rates, combined with short generation times, accelerated adaptation. Another factor shaping early insect evolution was the structure of the tracheal system. Oxygen entered through spiracles and diffused directly into tissues. In high-oxygen Carboniferous air, diffusion efficiency increased. Larger body sizes were possible. More active musculature could be supported. Early experiments with movement beyond simple crawling became physiologically feasible. As thoracic plates enlarged, muscles originally associated with leg movement could be co-opted to manipulate these extensions. Even slight twitching could alter airflow during descent. Random variation in muscle attachment points might produce individuals capable of limited flapping motions. Flapping likely began as instability rather than control. Uncontrolled oscillations during descent could generate small amounts of lift. Individuals that learned through neural adaptation to coordinate these oscillations gained advantage. The nervous system of insects, though simple compared to vertebrates, is highly efficient. Ganglia distributed along the ventral nerve cord control segment-specific functions. Local reflex loops allow rapid adjustments without centralized processing. This decentralized architecture is well suited to high-frequency wing beats, which in modern insects can exceed hundreds of beats per second. Although such rapid wing beats were not yet present, the neurological groundwork existed. Fossil evidence from the late Carboniferous reveals increasingly sophisticated wing venation patterns in early pterygot insects. Veins provided structural reinforcement, preventing deformation under aerodynamic load. The arrangement of veins suggests gradual optimization for lift generation and maneuverability. The origin of insect wings remains debated. One hypothesis proposes that wings evolved from modified gills of aquatic ancestors. Some early insects may have had aquatic juvenile stages with lateral gill structures. Genetic similarities between gill development and wing development support this theory. Another hypothesis suggests wings originated from perinatal lobes, rigid extensions of the thoracic exoskeleton that initially served as stabilizers. Over time, These lobes may have articulated at their base and gained musculature. Regardless of origin, both hypotheses emphasize incremental modification rather than sudden innovation. The flight is energetically expensive. It requires continuous muscle contraction and coordination. Early flapping insects were likely weak flyers, capable only of short bursts. But even limited-powered flight dramatically alters survival dynamics. Imagine an insect that can flap briefly to extend the glide. It can travel further horizontally. It can escape predators more effectively. It can colonize isolated trees across swamp channels. Its genes spread across a wider geographic range. Gene flow increases genetic diversity within populations. Diversity fuels further adaptation, and evolution accelerates. The Carboniferous environment favored experimentation. High oxygen reduced physiological constraints. Vertical forests created aerodynamic test beds. Predation and disturbance created selection pressure. Insects, small and numerous, explored morphological space rapidly. But early insects were not alone in their innovations. Other arthropods also experimented with body form. Some lineages developed defensive spines. Others specialized feeding structures. Ecological interactions became increasingly complex. Yet insects possessed one decisive advantage. Their thoracic segmentation allowed paired appendages to evolve symmetrically. Bilateral symmetry is crucial for stable flight. Asymmetric wing development would produce rotational instability. Insects' modular body plan supported symmetrical extension. The first true winged insects, known as paleopterans, included early relatives of mayflies and dragonflies. These groups retain primitive features, such as the inability to fold wings flat over the abdomen. This suggests early wings were rigid structures with limited articulation. Folding wings evolved later in neopteran insects, allowing them to protect wings while crawling. This innovation expanded ecological niches further. In the late Carboniferous, the sky began to change. Initially, flights were short and clumsy. Insects may have launched from elevated positions rather than taking off from the ground. Jumping, followed by flapping, could generate lift. Landing likely remained hazardous, but each generation refined control. Wing venation patterns optimized strength-to-weight ratios, muscles specialized for oscillatory contraction, thoracic segments enlarged to house flight musculature. Insects became the first organisms to achieve sustained powered flight in Earth's history. This achievement cannot be overstated. Flight introduces a third dimension to ecology. Predators attack from above. Prey escape vertically. Pollination would later depend on it. Long-distance dispersal becomes routine. Colonization of isolated habitats accelerates. Although flowering plants did not yet exist, spore-bearing plants benefited indirectly. Insects feeding on spores could inadvertently disperse them. Ecological networks became more interconnected. Insects also began to influence atmospheric processes indirectly. Increased herbivory affected plant community composition. Plant evolution responded with defensive adaptations. Co-evolutionary dynamics intensified. The rise of winged insects marked the beginning of the most diverse lineage in the history of life. Today, insects account for more than half of all known species. That diversity traces back to Carboniferous experimentation. Yet the early stages were fragile. Wings were delicate structures. Fossil preservation of soft tissues is rare, making reconstruction challenging. Much of our understanding comes from impressions in shale deposits, where fine sediment captured wing venation patterns. These fossils reveal that by approximately 350 million years ago, multiple winged insect lineages had already diverged. This suggests that wing evolution occurred earlier, perhaps in the early Carboniferous or even late Devonian. Once flight emerged, it diversified rapidly. Some lineages specialized in gliding between trees. Others became agile aerial predators. Compound eyes provided wide fields of vision, essential for tracking movement in air. Sensory hairs detected airflow changes, aiding stability. Flight muscles in insects operate differently from vertebrate muscles. Many modern insects use asynchronous flight muscles, where a single nerve impulse triggers multiple contractions. This allows extremely high wing beat frequencies. Early insects likely used more primitive synchronous muscles, but still benefited from efficient energy transfer. The thorax evolved into a rigid, box-like structure optimized for flight. Internal cuticular ridges reinforced attachment points for powerful muscles. The abdomen became lighter and more flexible, reducing weight and improving maneuverability. As flight capability improved, ecological boundaries dissolved. Rivers and swamp channels that once isolated populations became trivial obstacles. Insects could cross them easily. Gene flow increased. Speciation accelerated. Predator-prey relationships shifted dramatically. Aerial predation emerged. Early dragonfly-like insects became formidable hunters, capturing prey mid-air with spiny legs. This introduced new selective pressures on smaller insects, driving further innovation in speed and agility. The sky, once empty, became contested space. This transformation began quietly, with minor thoracic extensions and controlled falls. It culminated in one of the most significant evolutionary radiations in Earth's history. But in Chapter 3, we focus on the threshold, the rise of the first insects, from ground-dwelling crawlers to experimental gliders. Their success was not inevitable. Countless variations failed. Many lineages disappeared. Evolution is wasteful. It produces far more forms than survive. But among those variations, wings emerged. And once wings existed, the trajectory of life
Buried
on
over time,
land
decaying plants are compressed
changed
into peat.
permanently.
Deeper
The
burial
rise
transforms
of the
peat into
first
coal.
insects represents the foundation upon which all later aerial ecosystems were built. Birds, pterosaurs, and bats would not appear for hundreds of millions of years. When they did, they entered a sky already shaped by insect. In the Carboniferous superworld, amid humid swamps and towering lycopsids, the first wing beats broke the silence. Life had conquered the land. Now, for the first time in planetary history, it began to conquer the air. At some point in the late Carboniferous, something extraordinary happened. A structure that had never before existed in the history of life began to take shape. Not a limb for walking, not a fin for swimming, not a jaw for biting, but a surface designed to interact with air in a way that could generate lift. The origin of wings was not a single event. It was a process, slow, incremental, and shaped by selection acting on small variations over millions of years. But when viewed across deep time, it represents one of the most radical anatomical innovations ever achieved. To understand how wings emerged, we must examine both anatomy and physics. Flight requires 4 essential components: lift, thrust, weight reduction, and control. Lift must exceed body weight. Thrust must counteract drag. Weight must be minimized without sacrificing structural integrity. Control must be precise enough to maintain stability in an inherently unstable medium. Air is not a solid surface. It yields. It shifts. It produces turbulence to remain airborne. An organism must constantly adjust. Early insects did not immediately master these demands. Their first wings were not optimized airfoils. They were extensions, flattened structures projecting laterally from the thorax. These structures may have originated in one of 2 primary ways. The first hypothesis suggests that wings evolved from modified gills of aquatic ancestors. Some early insect relatives had aquatic juvenile stages with abdominal or thoracic gill plates used for respiration. These plates were flat, vascularized, and positioned laterally structurally similar to early wing buds. Genetic studies in modern insects show overlap between genes controlling gill development and wing development, lending support to this theory. The second hypothesis proposes that wings evolved from paranotal lobes, rigid outgrowths of the thoracic exoskeleton. These lobes may have initially functioned as stabilizers during falling thermoregulatory surfaces or protective flanges shielding spiracles. Over time, articulation at their base could have allowed movement. It is possible that both hypotheses contain elements of truth. Evolution frequently repurposes existing tissues, combining developmental pathways to produce new structures. Regardless of origin, the transformation from static plate to functional wing required several anatomical breakthroughs. First, articulation. A rigid extension provides drag but cannot generate thrust. For thrust, the structure must move relative to the body. This demands a joint. Joints require reinforced cuticle, muscle attachment points, and neural coordination. Second, musculature. Muscles must attach in ways that allow controlled oscillation. In insects, indirect flight muscles evolved that deform the thoracic exoskeleton itself. The contraction of one muscle group alters thoracic shape, causing wings to move upward. The contraction of another group reverses the motion. This design allows extremely rapid wing beats with minimal neural input. Third, reinforcement. Early wings were thin membranes supported by a network of veins. These veins provided rigidity while keeping weight low. They also carried hemolymph and nerves. The pattern of venation in fossil insects shows increasing complexity over time, suggesting progressive optimization for load distribution. Fourth, neural integration. Flight demands real-time adjustment to air currents. Sensory structures, mechanoreceptors detect changes in airflow, feedback loops adjust wing stroke amplitude and frequency. Without such control, early flyers would tumble in the dense Carboniferous forests. Early gliders likely launched from elevated perches. Gravity provided initial acceleration. Wings extended laterally, increased drag and perhaps generated small amounts of lift when angled correctly. Individuals capable of slight downward strokes could extend horizontal distance traveled. A glide ratio of even 1:1, traveling 1 meter forward for every meter descended, would represent enormous advantage over simple falling. Over generations, natural selection would favor individuals capable of improving that ratio. As wing articulation improved, powered strokes emerged. Powered flight differs from gliding in that lift and thrust are generated actively rather than passively. Flapping wings accelerate air downward and backward. By Newton's third law, equal and opposite reaction forces push the insect upward and forward. Early flapping likely began as exaggerated stabilization movements during descent. Oscillations that initially served to maintain balance may have incidentally produced lift. Once lift exceeded weight momentarily, selection would favor stronger muscles and larger wing surfaces. Oxygen-rich Carboniferous air facilitated this process. Higher oxygen concentration enhances aerobic metabolism, supporting sustained muscle activity. Insects relying on tracheal diffusion could maintain higher metabolic output than under modern conditions. Fossils from the late Carboniferous reveal early winged insects with two pairs of wings, one attached to the mesothorax and one to the metathorax. This dual wing arrangement increased lift and control. In some lineages, the forewings and hindwings were similar in size. In others, differentiation occurred, allowing specialized aerodynamic roles. One of the earliest major groups of winged insects was the Paleodictyopterans. These insects possessed large wings with intricate venation and, in some cases, additional wing-like lobes on abdominal segments. They were among the dominant aerial organisms of their time. Another lineage gave rise to early mayflies. Mayflies exhibit a primitive wing posture. They cannot fold their wings flat over their backs. This suggests early wings were rigid structures held upright at rest. Wing folding evolved later in more advanced insects, providing protection and enabling crawling in confined spaces. The emergence of flight immediately restructured ecosystems. Before wings, predators and prey interacted primarily within the forest floor and lower canopy. With flight, insects could exploit the canopy fully. They could traverse swamp channels, escape terrestrial predators, and colonize isolated vegetation patches. Predation also moved into the air. Among the most formidable early flyers were the griffinflies, relatives of modern dragonflies but significantly larger. These insects possessed elongated bodies, powerful jaws, and large compound eyes adapted for aerial hunting. They were apex predators of the Carboniferous sky. Their wingspans could exceed 60 centimeters in high oxygen air. Their large body size did not preclude effective respiration. Their flight likely involved slower wing beats compared to modern dragonflies, but generated sufficient lift in dense air. Aerial predation introduced new selective pressures on smaller insects. Speed, maneuverability, and camouflage became crucial. Wing morphology diversified rapidly. Some lineages favored broad wings for gliding. Others evolved narrow, elongated wings for speed. Flight also transformed reproduction. Mating displays could now occur in open air. Individuals capable of agile flight could access mates over larger territories. Sexual selection began to shape wing coloration and behavior. Although the Carboniferous lacked flowering plants and modern pollination systems, visual signaling in open air became possible. Dispersal distances expanded dramatically. An insect capable of flying even a few kilometers could bridge habitat gaps created by fires or climatic fluctuations. Populations previously isolated by swamp channels became genetically connected. Gene flow increased adaptive potential. With expanded range came expanded ecological opportunity. Insects began to exploit new feeding strategies. Some specialized in piercing plant tissues. Others consumed spores in the canopy. Predatory species captured prey mid-flight. Ecological networks grew more complex and layered. The thorax of flying insects evolved into a specialized engine. Cuticular reinforcements formed a rigid box housing powerful muscles. Indirect flight muscles allowed efficient oscillation without requiring each wing beat to be triggered individually by nerve impulses. This innovation reduced neural load and increased wing beat frequency. The wing hinge mechanism became a masterpiece of biological engineering. Small sclerites, hardened plates, formed pivot points. Elasticity within the cuticle allowed energy storage and release during each stroke, improving efficiency. Flight is energetically expensive, but insects compensated through lightweight construction. Their exoskeleton provided strength without excessive mass. Internal organs were compact. Hemolymph circulated nutrients without heavy vascular systems. Early flight was likely imperfect. Turbulence in dense forest environments would challenge stability. Wind shear above the canopy could destabilize weak flyers. Many individuals likely perished during early experimentation, but evolution does not require perfection, only relative advantage. Once sustained flight became viable, diversification accelerated. Fossil deposits from late Carboniferous strata reveal a remarkable array of wing shapes and sizes. Venation patterns became diagnostic for different lineages. indicating rapid speciation. This radiation represents one of the earliest major evolutionary explosions on land. Flight also influenced plant evolution indirectly. Insects feeding on spores may have increased dispersal efficiency. Herbivory pressures could have shaped leaf morphology and chemical defenses. Co-evolutionary dynamics intensified. It is important to note that vertebrates remained earthbound. Early reptiles were small and lacked structural modifications for aerial locomotion. Their internal skeletons would eventually give rise to pterosaurs hundreds of millions of years later. But in the Carboniferous, the sky belonged exclusively to insects. This exclusivity lasted for more than 150 million years. For an immense span of geological time, insects were the only masters of powered flight. They monopolized aerial niches. They refined aerodynamic strategies. They evolved folding wings, asynchronous muscles, and increasingly sophisticated sensory systems. The origin of wings therefore represents not merely a new trait, but the opening of an entirely new ecological dimension. Three-dimensional ecosystems emerged. Predator-prey interactions expanded vertically. Competition extended into airspace. Dispersal reshaped biogeography. The Carboniferous forests, once static in vertical structure, became dynamic environments where organisms moved freely between layers. And yet, the leap from ground to air began with something simple, a structure that slowed a fall. Evolution rarely invents from scratch. It modifies, it repurposes, it builds upon what already exists. The first wings were not engineered masterpieces. They were incremental adjustments that happened to interact advantageously with air. Over millions of years, these adjustments accumulated, articulation improved, muscles strengthened, neural coordination refined, venation optimized. Eventually, the first true flyers lifted off not merely to glide, but to sustain themselves against gravity through active propulsion. When that threshold was crossed, the planet changed irreversibly. The sky, once silent, filled with movement, and life, for the first time in its 4 billion year history, had conquered not only land and sea, but air itself. Once flight became established, evolution did not hesitate. It accelerated. What began as modest gliding experiments and short bursts of powered movement expanded into an era of aerial dominance unlike anything the planet would see again. During the late Carboniferous and into the early Permian, the sky did not merely contain insects, it was ruled by giants. To modern eyes, the idea of dragonflies with wingspans approaching that of a hawk sounds exaggerated, but the fossil record leaves little doubt. Among the most iconic aerial predators of this period was Meganeura, a griffinfly whose wings could span nearly 70 centimeters. This was not a dragonfly in the modern sense, but a close relative part of a lineage that preceded true odonates, Meganeura. Meganeura's existence was made possible by a combination of atmospheric chemistry and anatomical refinement. Its wings were long, narrow, and reinforced with dense venation. The thorax housed powerful flight musculature. Its compound eyes were large, providing wide visual fields for tracking prey in midair. Spiny legs formed a basket-like structure for capturing smaller insects during flight. This was an apex predator of the Carboniferous sky. The presence of such giants forces us to confront an important question. Why were insects able to reach such extraordinary sizes during this period, and why can they not do so today? The answer lies primarily in oxygen. Modern insects are constrained in size by their tracheal respiratory system. Oxygen enters through spiracles and diffuses directly to tissues. Diffusion is efficient over short distances, but becomes limiting as body size increases. Larger bodies require either active ventilation or circulatory oxygen transport systems, neither of which insects evolved. In the Carboniferous, atmospheric oxygen levels were significantly higher than today, possibly exceeding 30%. This increased the partial pressure of oxygen, enhancing diffusion rates into tissues. As a result, insects could sustain larger bodies without suffocating their internal cells. Higher oxygen levels also improve muscle performance. Flight is metabolically expensive. The ability to generate sustained wing beats depends on continuous aerobic respiration. In oxygen-rich air, this demand could be met more easily. But oxygen alone does not explain gigantism. Ecological opportunity played a crucial role. When insects first achieved flight, they entered an empty aerial niche. There were no birds, no bats, no flying reptiles, no vertebrate competitors at all. The sky was uncontested. In ecology, empty niches invite expansion. Without aerial predators to regulate size, insects could explore larger body forms. Predatory species such as Meganeura benefited from increased size because it allowed them to overpower prey, travel longer distances efficiently, and dominate territories. Larger wings generate more lift, but they also require stronger structural support. The venation patterns in Meganeura's wings show intricate reinforcement, distributing aerodynamic stress across a network of veins. This design minimized tearing and allowed sustained gliding combined with flapping. The flight style of Meganeura was likely similar to that of modern dragonflies, a combination of gliding and powerful flapping strokes. Dragonflies use a unique flight mechanism in which forewings and hindwings beat out of phase, improving lift and reducing aerodynamic interference. Fossil morphology suggests that Meganeura may have employed a comparable strategy. Imagine standing in a Carboniferous swamp forest as one of these giants passes overhead. Its wings hum at lower frequencies than modern dragonflies due to larger mass. Sunlight filters through spore-filled air as the shadow of its wings sweeps across the canopy. Below, smaller insects scatter. But Meganeura was not alone. The Carboniferous sky hosted a diverse array of winged insects. Paleodictyopterans, some with wingspans of 30 centimeters or more, glided between towering lycopsids. Early mayfly relatives drifted near wetlands. A primitive cockroach-like insects Some capable of flight scuttled and occasionally lifted into the air to escape predators. These lineages demonstrate that flight had diversified rapidly. Wing shapes varied. Some were broad and rounded, optimized for maneuverability. Others were elongated and narrow, favoring speed and endurance. Size confers both advantages and constraints. Larger insects have greater inertia, making rapid turns more difficult. But they also possess greater glide ratios and energy reserves in dense forests. Maneuverability is critical. In more open canopy spaces, speed and reach become advantageous. The Carboniferous forest canopy was not uniform. Storms periodically opened gaps. Fires cleared swaths of vegetation along river margins. Open corridors existed. Giant flyers could exploit these spaces effectively. The ecological consequences of giant aerial predators were profound. Predation from above forced smaller insects to evolve countermeasures. Camouflage patterns became more sophisticated. Erratic flight paths may have evolved as escape strategies. Some lineages likely shifted activity periods to reduce exposure. Arms races intensified. As predators improved visual acuity and flight speed, prey species responded with enhanced sensory detection and agility. Compound eyes became more refined. Mechanoreceptors along wing margins detected airflow disturbances, enabling rapid, evasive maneuvers. Flight also altered energy transfer through ecosystems. Prior to aerial predation, energy moved primarily along ground-based food webs. Now, insects feeding on plant tissues or spores became prey for aerial hunters. Biomass was redistributed vertically. Nutrient cycling incorporated a new dimension. Giant insects also influenced terrestrial vertebrates, amphibians and early reptiles, occasionally preyed upon winged insects when they landed. The abundance of aerial prey may have contributed to diversification in early insectivorous vertebrates. But the dominance of giant insects was not permanent. Toward the end of the Carboniferous and into the Permian, atmospheric oxygen levels began to decline. Tectonic shifts, climatic changes, and alterations in carbon cycling reduced oxygen concentration. As oxygen levels fell, the physiological constraints on insect size tightened. Diffusion became less efficient for large-bodied insects. Maintaining oxygen supply to tissues at meganeura-scale dimensions grew increasingly difficult. Gigantism receded. Fossil evidence indicates that griffinfly sizes diminished in the Permian. Eventually, the lineage went extinct. Modern dragonflies, while impressive, are modest in comparison to their Carboniferous ancestors. The decline of giant insects illustrates how tightly evolution is coupled to environmental parameters. Anatomy evolves within constraints imposed by physics and chemistry. When those constraints shift, selective landscapes change. Yet for millions of years, the Carboniferous sky belonged to giants. It is important to recognize that these insects were not evolutionary mistakes or temporary aberrations. They were highly successful organisms occupying apex predator roles in aerial ecosystems. Their extinction was not due to inferiority, but to changing atmospheric and climatic conditions. Giant insects also challenge our perception of ancient ecosystems. When we imagine prehistoric life, we often picture dinosaurs, but dinosaurs would not appear until the late Triassic, nearly 100 million years later. During the Carboniferous, insects were the dominant terrestrial innovators. They were the first to exploit three-dimensional space fully. They were the first to establish aerial food chains. They were the first to demonstrate that powered flight could transform planetary ecology. Flight reshaped insect development as well. Life cycles adapted to aerial mobility. Dispersal of eggs over wider areas reduced competition among offspring. Mating rituals incorporated flight displays. Territories expanded vertically as well as horizontally. Some insects evolved behaviors tied to wind currents, using thermal updrafts to extend range. Even without the refined aerodynamic control of birds, they exploited atmospheric dynamics effectively. The Carboniferous atmosphere itself may have influenced flight mechanics. Higher oxygen concentration slightly increases air density. Denser air improves lift generation at lower speeds. This would have benefited large winged insects, allowing them to remain airborne with slower wing beats. However, high oxygen also increases flammability. Evidence of widespread wildfires during the Carboniferous suggests that forests periodically burned intensely. Aerial mobility would have been advantageous during such disturbances. Insects capable of flight could escape advancing flames more readily than ground-bound organisms. Disturbance ecology therefore reinforced the value of flight. The presence of giant aerial predators also likely influenced insect morphology beyond size alone. Reinforced cuticles protected against predation. Behavioral adaptations such as crepuscular activity may have evolved to avoid peak predator activity. As ecosystems grew more complex, specialization increased. Not all insects became giants. Many remained small and agile. Size diversity expanded ecological roles. Some insects specialized in rapid darting flight within dense foliage. Others soared above canopy gaps. The Carboniferous represents a rare moment in Earth's history when environmental conditions permitted an experiment in gigantism among flying arthropods. It would not be repeated. When vertebrate flyers eventually appeared, pterosaurs in the late Triassic, birds in the Jurassic, bats in the Paleogene, they entered a sky already shaped by insect flight. But by then, insect gigantism had receded. Vertebrates never competed with meganeurosized insects because they evolved long after atmospheric conditions changed. Thus, the era of giant insects stands alone a testament to how atmospheric chemistry can unlock evolutionary possibilities. Imagine again that ancient sky, humid air saturated with oxygen, towering lycopsids casting long shadows across peat-rich swamps, amphibians croaking near stagnant pools, and overhead, massive wings beating slowly, patrolling territories that stretched across kilometers of forest. This was the first age of aerial dominance. Flight had begun modestly, but within millions of years it produced giants. The conquest of the sky was not merely symbolic, it restructured ecosystems permanently. Once organisms evolved the capacity to move freely through air, the planet would never return to a purely ground-bound terrestrial ecology. Even as oxygen levels declined and giant insects faded, flight remained. Smaller, more efficient flyers persisted. Wing folding evolved, enabling insects to exploit confined habitats. Asynchronous flight muscles improved energy efficiency, diversity expanded further. Today, insects remain the most diverse and abundant flying organisms on Earth. Their Carboniferous ancestors pioneered every fundamental aerodynamic strategy still in use. The giants of the Carboniferous sky may be gone, but their legacy endures in every dragonfly hovering above a pond, in every mayfly rising from water at dusk, in every insect that lifts itself against gravity. They were the first to master the air at scale. And for a remarkable span of geological time, they ruled it. The moment insects achieved sustained powered flight, the transformation of Earth's ecosystems was irreversible. Flight was not merely an additional mode of locomotion, it was a structural shift in how energy moved, how species interacted, how genes flowed, and how landscapes were colonized. The conquest of air did not just expand habitat, it multiplied ecological possibility. Before flight, terrestrial ecosystems were fundamentally two-dimensional organisms moved across surfaces, soil, water margins, tree trunks. Vertical structure existed in forests, but it functioned as a gradient rather than a navigable space. Climbing was laborious and risky. Dispersal required crawling or drifting passively. Flight shattered those limitations. Suddenly, height was not a barrier, it was a resource. The Carboniferous forests were immense vertical labyrinths. Trunks rose like pillars from waterlogged ground. Canopy layers intercepted sunlight, creating stratified microclimates before wings. Movement between these layers required slow ascent or dangerous descent. After wings, transitions between layers became fluid. This vertical fluidity restructured predator-prey relationships. Ground predators could no longer assume that prey would remain within reach. Aerial escape became common, and insects that sensed vibration or shadow could launch instantly, avoiding capture. This pressured terrestrial predators to adapt either by improving ambush strategies or by exploiting new prey sources. Simultaneously, aerial predation intensified. Large flying insects such as griffinflies hunted mid-air. The sky became a contested arena. Prey species evolved erratic flight paths, improved sensory detection, and morphological defenses. Energy transfer patterns shifted. In pre-flight ecosystems, plant biomass was consumed by ground herbivores and detritivores. With flight, insects feeding on canopy tissues or spores could transport that energy across spatial gaps. Aerial predators then redistributed that energy downward through waste, carcasses, or predation. Nutrient cycling became vertically integrated. Flight also accelerated gene flow. In evolutionary biology, dispersal determines population structure. Limited dispersal leads to isolated populations, promoting divergence. High dispersal increases genetic mixing, slowing speciation in some cases, but also spreading adaptive traits rapidly. Insects capable of flying even modest distances could cross swamp channels, fire-cleared gaps, and climatic gradients. This mobility reduced isolation. Adaptive mutations could spread across regions more efficiently. Evolutionary responses to environmental change became faster. But flight did not merely homogenize populations, it also allowed colonization of new niches. Consider a newly formed forest gap after wildfire. Sunlight penetrates to the ground. Pioneer plants germinate rapidly before flight. Colonization by insects would depend on slow crawling or passive drift. After flight, insects could arrive within hours or days. They would feed, reproduce, and establish populations before competitors arrived. This rapid colonization dynamic increased ecological turnover. Succession accelerated. Interactions intensified. Flight also influenced reproductive strategies. Mate location became less constrained by proximity. Individuals could search larger territories. Courtship displays evolved in open air. Some early insects may have developed visual signals, wing vibrations, or aerial maneuvers as part of mating rituals. Sexual selection, therefore, began to act on flight performance itself. Agility, endurance, and precision could determine mating success. Over time, these pressures refined wing morphology and neuromuscular coordination. Flight also allowed escape from deteriorating conditions. The Carboniferous climate was not static. Glacial cycles in southern Gondwana influenced sea levels and rainfall patterns. Swamps expanded and contracted. Fires periodically reshaped landscapes. Insects capable of relocating rapidly had higher survival probabilities. Dispersal buffers extinction risk. Species confined to limited areas are vulnerable to localized catastrophes. Flight expands range, reducing the likelihood that a single disturbance eliminates an entire lineage. Over millions of years, this mobility advantage contributed to the extraordinary resilience of insects as a clade. Another transformation occurred at the sensory level. Navigating air requires different information than navigating solid surfaces. Wind speed, direction, turbulence, and thermals all influence stability. Insects evolve mechanosensory hairs along wings and bodies to detect airflow changes. Compound eyes, already effective at motion detection, became even more crucial for tracking moving objects in three-dimensional space. Neural circuits adapted for rapid processing of visual input. Aerial navigation demands millisecond-scale adjustments. Insects evolved decentralized neural control, allowing reflexive corrections without centralized processing delays. Flight also imposed energetic constraints. Powered flight is metabolically demanding. Insects evolved efficient flight muscles capable of high-frequency oscillations. Asynchronous flight muscles, in which a single nerve impulse triggers multiple contractions through stretch activation, allowed extremely high wing beat rates with reduced neural input. Although asynchronous muscles evolved later in more derived lineages, the foundation was laid in early flyers. Thoracic architecture became specialized for energy storage and release. Elastic elements in the exoskeleton conserved mechanical energy between wing strokes. This mechanical efficiency allowed sustained flight without excessive metabolic cost. As flight became more efficient, insects expanded into new climatic zones. Cooler regions could be colonized if flight muscles generated sufficient heat. Dispersal across latitudinal gradients increased. Flight also transformed competition before wings. Competition occurred primarily among organisms sharing ground-level niches. After wings, vertical partitioning reduced direct competition. Species specialized in different canopy layers, open air or ground interface zones. Ecological networks gained complexity. Trophic cascades extended upward and downward. The three-dimensionality of ecosystems increased species richness by expanding niche space. Insects also influenced plant evolution indirectly through flight. Although flowering plants had not yet evolved in the Carboniferous, spore dispersal and herbivory patterns were affected. Insects, feeding on reproductive structures, could transport spores across distances. Selective pressure on plant defenses increased as mobile herbivores exploited canopy tissues. Co-evolutionary dynamics intensified. Flight also introduced behavioral plasticity. Insects could adjust altitude based on temperature, humidity, or predator presence. Microclimatic gradients within forests became navigable. Behavioral flexibility enhances survival under fluctuating conditions. As aerial ecosystems matured, diversity expanded. Different flight styles evolved. Some insects specialized in sustained gliding, conserving energy by exploiting air currents. Others developed rapid darting flight suited for dense foliage. Some hovered near vegetation, while others patrolled open canopy spaces. Wing morphology diversified accordingly. Broad wings generate high lift at low speeds, but increase drag. Narrow wings favor speed and endurance. Vein density affects structural rigidity and weight. Subtle variations in wing angle and stroke amplitude influence maneuverability. These variations represent evolutionary fine-tuning driven by ecological context. Flight also altered predator perception. Prey could no longer rely solely on substrate vibration detection. Aerial predators approached silently from above. Selection favored improved visual acuity and faster reaction times among prey species. The sky became both refuge and threat. This duality drove continuous adaptation. Another profound effect of flight was geographic expansion. Insects became the first organisms capable of routinely crossing geographic barriers such as rivers, shallow seas, or mountain foothills. While large oceans remained formidable obstacles, short-distance overwater dispersal became feasible. And colonization began. Islands represent natural laboratories of evolution. Isolation fosters divergence. Flying insects could reach newly formed land masses following volcanic activity or sea level changes. Speciation events multiplied. Biogeography changed permanently. In evolutionary terms, flight increases effective population size across landscapes. Larger interconnected populations reduce inbreeding and buffer against genetic drift. Adaptive traits spread more widely. This enhanced connectivity contributed to the long-term evolutionary success of insects. Over geological timescales, insects survived mass extinctions that eliminated many vertebrate lineages. Their dispersal capacity, reproductive rate, and ecological flexibility played central roles in this resilience. The Carboniferous origin of flight set the stage for that durability. It is important to emphasize that flight did not eliminate ground-based life. Rather, it layered additional complexity onto existing systems. Ground arthropods continued to thrive. Amphibians diversified. Early reptiles expanded. But now, interactions extended upward. Flight also changed the temporal dynamics of ecosystems. Daily activity cycles expanded. Insects could exploit diurnal and crepuscular conditions differently. Aerial cooling effects influenced thermoregulation. Behavior diversified. In a broader evolutionary context, the emergence of flight in insects preceded and possibly influenced later vertebrate flight when pterosaurs evolved in the late Triassic. They entered an ecosystem where insect flight had already shaped aerial niches for over 100 million years. Vertebrate flyers would eventually dominate larger aerial predator roles, but they built upon a sky structured by insect innovation. Flight also influenced fossilization patterns. Wing impressions in fine sediment reveal detailed venation patterns. These fossils provide insight into aerodynamic evolution. Without flight, such delicate structures would not exist in the fossil record. The preservation of these wings in Carboniferous shales allows us to reconstruct early aerodynamic experiments with remarkable precision. As the Permian approached, atmospheric oxygen levels began to decline. Gigantism among insects diminished. But flight itself persisted. Smaller, more efficient forms replaced the giants. This transition underscores a key principle. While environmental conditions shape trait expression, once a major innovation emerges, it is rarely lost entirely. Flight was too advantageous to disappear. Even under lower oxygen conditions, smaller insects could maintain aerial lifestyles. Wingfolding evolved, enhancing survivability in confined spaces. Diversification accelerated further. Today, insects remain the most species-rich clade of animals on Earth. Their success traces directly back to the Carboniferous conquest of air. Flight-enabled pollination. Once flowering plants evolved, it facilitated decomposition and nutrient cycling. It allowed insects to colonize deserts, forests, mountains, and tundra. It shaped terrestrial ecosystems more profoundly than any other single locomotor innovation. In Chapter 6, we recognize that flight did not merely change insects, it changed the planet. Ecosystems became volumetric rather than planar. Energy moved in new pathways. Species interacted across layers. Evolutionary tempo increased. The Carboniferous sky, once silent, became dynamic. And from that moment forward, Earth's biosphere would always include an aerial dimension. Flight changed everything. When the first insects lifted themselves into the air more than 350 million years ago, they did more than solve a local survival problem. They initiated a permanent transformation of life on Earth. The conquest of the skies by insects was not a temporary experiment. It was the foundation of a new biological reality, one that would echo through every subsequent era, shaping the evolution of plants, vertebrates, ecosystems, and even the structure of modern biodiversity. To understand the full legacy of the first flies,
Buried over time,
we
decaying
must
plants are
zoom
compressed
out
into peat.
beyond the
Deeper burial
Carboniferous
transforms
swamps
peat into coal.
and examine what followed. For tens of millions of years after flight evolved, insects were the only animals capable of powered aerial locomotion. This monopoly is astonishing when viewed from a deep time perspective. For roughly 150 million years, the sky belonged exclusively to arthropods. During this time, flight diversified dramatically. Early Paleopteran insects such as griffinflies and primitive mayflies established the first aerial predator-prey systems. But evolution did not stop there. A critical innovation emerged later: the ability to fold wings flat over the abdomen. This adaptation, seen in neopteran insects, allowed wings to be protected while crawling in tight spaces. It reduced the risk of damage and opened ecological niches in dense vegetation, under bark, and within debris layers. Wing folding represents a mechanical refinement that dramatically increased survivability. Once wings could be folded, insects expanded into nearly every terrestrial microhabitat. Cockroach ancestors, beetle precursors, and early orthopteran lineages diversified, although flowering plants had not yet evolved. Gymnosperms and seed ferns dominated later Permian landscapes. Insects adapted to new plant tissues, feeding strategies, and reproductive structures. Flight made this adaptive radiation possible. By the Permian period, insects had already developed a wide array of wing forms, mouthparts, and ecological roles. Herbivores, predators, scavengers, and detritivores all exploited the aerial dimension to some extent. Then came catastrophe. Approximately 252 million years ago, at the end of the Permian period, the largest mass extinction in Earth's history reshaped the biosphere. Volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia triggered massive climate disruption, ocean acidification, and atmospheric changes. Up to 90% of marine species and a significant portion of terrestrial species vanished. Insects suffered losses as well. many lineages disappeared. Giant griffin flies were already declining, and atmospheric oxygen levels had fallen significantly compared to the Carboniferous peak. Yet insects survived. Their small body size, rapid reproduction, and dispersal ability likely buffered them against complete collapse. Flight allowed surviving populations to relocate as climates shifted. Within millions of years, insect diversity rebounded. This resilience would become a defining feature of the group. As the Triassic period unfolded, a new lineage of flying animals appeared: pterosaurs. Pterosauria. Pterosaurs were vertebrates, reptiles that evolved membranous wings, supported by an elongated fourth finger. Unlike insects, they possessed internal skeletons, lungs with active ventilation, and more complex brains. Their emergence marked the second independent origin of powered flight in Earth's history. But pterosaurs did not invent aerial ecosystems. They entered a sky long shaped by insects. Small insects likely formed a significant portion of early pterosaur diets. Aerial predation patterns already existed. Flight mechanics had already been tested by natural selection for over 100 million years. In this sense, insect flight preconditioned the biosphere for vertebrate flight. Later, during the Jurassic period, another lineage achieved powered flight: birds. Archaeopteryx. Birds evolved from theropod dinosaurs, developing feathers initially used for insulation or display. Eventually, these feathers became aerodynamic surfaces capable of generating lift. Powered flight in birds represents a third independent solution to the problem insects had solved first. Again, birds entered a sky inhabited by insects. Insect flight influenced bird evolution profoundly. Early birds fed on insects. Aerial maneuverability likely evolved in part as a response to capturing agile prey. The evolutionary arms race extended across phyla. Much later still, in the Paleogene period, mammals achieved powered flight through bats. Chiroptera. Bats represent the fourth and final independent origin of powered flight among animals. Their membranous wings stretch between elongated fingers, forming flexible aerodynamic surfaces. Like pterosaurs and birds, bats evolved into aerial ecosystems already structured by insects. Many bats specialize in insectivory. Echolocation evolved partly as a strategy for detecting flying prey at night. The pattern is clear. Insects pioneered flight. Vertebrates followed. But the legacy of the first flyers extends beyond influencing later flyers. Perhaps the most transformative ecological development occurred during the Cretaceous period, with the rise of flowering plants, angiosperms. Flowers evolved intricate reproductive structures, often relying on animal pollinators. Insects were perfectly positioned to exploit this opportunity. Flight allowed insects to move between flowers efficiently, transporting pollen across distances. Co-evolution between flowering plants and insects led to extraordinary diversification on both sides. Beetles, flies, butterflies, and bees evolved specialized mouthparts, sensory systems, and behaviors tailored to nectar feeding and pollination. In return, plants evolve colors, scents, and nectar rewards. This mutualistic relationship reshaped terrestrial ecosystems permanently. Today, much of global agriculture depends on insect pollination. Fruit production, seed formation, and biodiversity maintenance are all tied to insect flight. None of this would exist without the Carboniferous origin of wings. Insects also play central roles in decomposition and nutrient cycling. Flying adults disperse to new habitats, lay eggs in decaying material, and accelerate breakdown processes. This mobility ensures that organic matter is recycled efficiently across landscapes. Flight also contributes to insect global distribution. Insects inhabit nearly every terrestrial environment, from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra. Their dispersal capacity allows them to track climatic shifts during ice ages. Insect populations migrated. During warming phases, they expanded. This adaptability is rooted in flight. Another enduring legacy of insect flight is the scale of biodiversity it enabled. Insects today represent more than half of all described species on Earth. Their diversity surpasses that of vertebrates by orders of magnitude. Flight facilitated this diversification by increasing niche space. Three-dimensional ecosystems offer more opportunities than two-dimensional ones. Aerial niches multiply habitat complexity. Every forest canopy contains microhabitats, accessible primarily through flight. Every meadow supports pollinator networks sustained by aerial mobility. The Carboniferous revolution continues to shape modern ecology. Even in human history, insect flight has had enormous consequences. Mosquitoes transmit diseases across continents. Locust swarms travel vast distances, altering agriculture. Butterflies migrate seasonally across thousands of kilometers. Bees support food production. Insect flight intersects with human civilization in ways both beneficial and harmful. But stepping back to geological perspective, the deeper legacy lies in how flight altered evolutionary tempo. Flight accelerates evolution. It increases dispersal, enabling rapid colonization and gene flow. It enhances survival under environmental stress, and it fosters specialization and co-evolution. It promotes resilience in the face of extinction events. Without flight, insects might have remained minor terrestrial arthropods. With flight, they became dominant architects of terrestrial ecosystems. It is also important to consider what did not happen. Vertebrates did not pioneer flight. Reptiles, amphibians, and early mammals remained earthbound for hundreds of millions of years after insects took to the skies. The structural complexity of vertebrate skeletons made aerial experimentation more constrained. Small-bodied exoskeletal arthropods were better suited for early aerodynamic innovation. In this sense, the Carboniferous sky was an arthropod experiment, one that succeeded spectacularly. The eventual decline of giant insects reminds us that environmental conditions constrain possibility. High oxygen allowed Meganeura-sized predators, lower oxygen restricted size, but even as gigantism faded, Flight remained. It was too powerful an adaptation to vanish. Today, every time a dragonfly hovers above a pond, it echoes a lineage stretching back to the Carboniferous. Every mayfly rising from water carries ancient aerodynamic heritage. Every beetle lifting from leaf litter traces its ancestry to those first experimental wings. The conquest of the skies was not a momentary event. It was a turning point in planetary history. Life had already transformed oceans and reshaped continents through biological processes, but by mastering air, it unlocked a dimension that would amplify evolutionary creativity beyond anything previously seen. The first flyers did not know they were initiating a revolution. They were simply responding to local pressures, escaping predators, gliding between trees, dispersing across swamps. Yet from those incremental steps emerged a cascade of consequences spanning hundreds of millions of years. Flight changed ecosystems. Flight shaped plant evolution. Flight influenced vertebrate innovation. Flight enabled biodiversity on unprecedented scale. The Carboniferous insects were pioneers of the third dimension. Long before birds painted the skies with feathers, before bats navigated night with echolocation, before humans dreamed of airplanes, insects had already solved the problem of lift, thrust, and control. They were the first masters of gravity. Their legacy is written not only in fossils of ancient wings, but in the living tapestry of modern ecosystem. Every buzzing meadow, every pollinated orchard, every aerial predator and prey interaction is part of a story that began 350 million years ago in oxygen-rich swamps beneath towering lycopsids. Life first took to the skies in that distant era, and once it did, the world was never the same again.